fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 23, No Time for Your Romantics. Rain drizzled down from the gray sky in a fine mist, soaking Eric to his core and causing him to shiver beneath his coat despite the warmer weather of this region. He folded his arms in around his chest, trying to hold in his body heat as he leaned out to peer up at the sky. It was uniform with clouds, telling him the wet was there to stay. Nestled dark against the horizon was an ominous shape, a mountain. Well, volcano, apparently. Eric had listened to a handful of tourists gush over how exciting it would be to visit the people that called it home. But all he saw was a busy little town snuggled up in its shadow like the famed Pompeii, and he prayed, for all it was worth to him, that the volcano would behave during their stay. He sighed as he stepped back under the covered awning that shielded the train platform and slumped down into a hard metal bench. They were in an industrial part of the city overlooking a switching station full of train cars. A smile twitched at the corner of his lips. Normally, he'd be marveling at the innovation, but there was hardly any room left in his exhausted brain. For as thin as his mind felt, no more a sieve for the thoughts that slipped right on through, it was heavy with the constant flashes of a half-dead god and the reminder of the horror on his father's face. He looked up at Artemis, lying flat on the bench opposite him, his stolen book held above his head, and then over to the sulky, who was slumped against Duck on the floor near the support column for the awning. The three of them had hardly exchanged any words after Indiga's little lecture. What was there left to say? Eric knew anything that came out of his mouth now, an apology or otherwise, would sound like a lie. How long are we going to wait here? Artemis turned his head, resting his open book against his chest. It was a fair question. They hadn't seen another person, let alone an escort, since they had initially disembarked. Shrugging, Eric made an aimless gesture with his blackened hands. I don't know. It's only been 30 minutes. I'm just asking if I have time for another chapter. The necromancer had been reading and rereading that book since they had fled Kunskap. Eric had no idea how the man had managed to find, let alone steal, such a thing from the death god, and if he had been in a better state of mind, he might be more interested. Instead, he just sighed and leaned his head back. Lyra took 3 days to speak to me, and Obis... Eric grimaced. It had become painfully obvious not all these gods wanted to see him. I don't know, man. Your guess is as good as mine. Let's go get something to eat. Indiga spoke at last, shifting around until he was on Duck's back. The dog stood, stretching his front paws forward, before his massive tail began to waggle in earnest. My Grammy always said, when you don't know what to do, have a hot meal and let the answers come to you. Besides, Imfaldir is the trade capital of the continent. It's supposed to have some of the best cuisine this side of Okari. Though his tone sounded friendly, Eric was keenly aware of the stiffness of his words. There was definitely still a rift between them. He exchanged a silent look with the necromancer, and then agreed with a sigh and a nod. Despite the mist and the muddy roads, their trek into the heart of Himfaldir was a short one. The train yard cut right through the outer edge of the city, surrounded by warehouses to hold and sort goods that came and went. As they traded the industrial district for the trade center, the city itself exploded before them in a firework of color. Every building was built from beautiful gray stone, flecked with streaks of copper and gold. Eric touched one as they continued down the main path, his fingers stumbling over rubies and sapphires embedded just beneath the surface. He realized, with a small subdued shock, that there were no seams, or in fact, tool marks of any kind. as if each structure was formed naturally. Trundling along the wide streets were horse-drawn carriages, simple electric bikes, and even something that resembled a bus on a singular rail, all moving effortlessly through the sea of people. The heart of the city beat in brilliant colors, all of it moving to the melody of the roaring crowd. Dusk elves, selkies, rakin, and countless other races packed every square inch squeezed in between the thousands of tents and stalls that lined the road, all of it leading toward a massive stone cathedral-style building. As they passed, Eric could read the sign that hung above the door labeling it as City Hall rather than a place of worship as he had first assumed. Thick scents of food tempted them left and right as they walked, drawing them ever deeper into the endless market. They ducked beneath banners and canopies, dodged hawkers and pamphlet passers, and they even had to fast-talk their way out of a free massage by a pair of owlish women wearing ornate dresses and laden with jewelry. There was a deep sense of culture here, despite the literal melting pot of races and customs. And regardless of the boisterous haggling and spirited debates, the city did not feel threatening. Though that could have come from their giant dog that cut a path in the sea of bodies. Indiga led them down a narrow alley between two multi-story stone buildings that looked like housing, and Eric felt a small chuckle leave his lungs. Where the main road had been large enough for a military parade, the area they walked now was barely 10 feet wide. Still, on either side of them were businesses. They were in a tightly cramped food alley. "Here, this one. I've heard good things about this place." Indiga hauled Duck to a stop outside a small noodle stand built right into the stone wall of the building behind it. He began to dismount, the dog far too large to enter the broom closet of an establishment. Eric looked up at the name of the shop, "Show You Can," and grumbled. He was starting to share his brother's distaste in puns as he leaned around the animal to peer inside the shop. Behind a curtained door, there were only 4 stools inside, all of them empty, and an ancient man stoking the fires in the stove that sat just on the other side of the small counter. He shifted to look at the sulky. "I don't think this place is—" "We're open! Come in or leave!" the shopkeep barked, waving his ladle at them. With Eric's help, Indiga led the way inside, depositing himself on the first stool. "This place is one of only 5 locations my family trades our catches to." A large grin spread over his face as he turned back. "What's on the menu today, Gramps?" "I'm not your Gramps." The old man shoved 3 porcelain bowls on the counter, judging the men with a scrutinizing gaze, before he set to work with the noodles. "Hope you all like fish." Eric was about to ask if it was shellfish, but stopped when the man, he realized was actually a selkie, his skin darker than Indiga's, pulled out a large, live fish and slapped it on the cooking surface behind the counter. There was a loud thunk of a cleaver, and he winced, grimacing a bit as the head of the animal was lobbed into a boiling pot. "Ooh, I recognize that type of fish." Indiga exchanged a happy grin with the others. "You're in for a treat." His smile only grew when the shop owner set down 3 small cups and filled them with a clear liquid. "It's got a buttery smooth taste that's fresh and—" "Can I get mine without fish?" Artemis interrupted, raising his fingers tentatively. He was worried that if he moved too fast, the old man would cleaver them off for someone else's meal. "Don't be silly. All our meals are served with fish." "Oh, I'm a vegetarian." Artemis winced when the old man shot him a dirty look, but threw his noodles into a different pot instead. He relaxed his shoulders with a sigh, whispering to the elf, "Necromancy means dealing with a lot of rotten flesh." His face twisted in disgust. "It's, hard to enjoy any sort of meat after that." Eric wasn't sure how he had gotten squished between Artemis and Indiga, but found the situation to be tense. The two didn't get along at the best of times, and turning down an authentic meal from Indiga's people probably wasn't doing the necromancer any favors. He didn't ask what the drink was, but sighed as he pulled one of the cups towards him as Indiga and Artemis began to bicker at one another through him. Eric tossed back the contents, shuddering at the bitter bite of alcohol as it slammed into the back of his throat. He had closed his eyes, doing his best to ignore the arguing and the horrifying flashes of Obus's face when the three bowls were shifted to their side of the counter, pulling Eric from his thoughts. A divine scent tickled his senses, and it was strong enough to make him forget about everything else buzzing around in his mind. A giant slab of white fish had been laid over perfectly folded buckwheat noodles with a simple, light-colored broth surrounding it. A sprinkle of green onions gave it a pop of color, and he couldn't wait for the utensils. He plucked up the bowl and tilted it back, slurping down the soup with greed. It was the perfect harmony of salt and savory. Eric's body warmed, his soul soothed just a little as the hot liquid slid down his throat and radiated outward. He was reminded of the sick days he had had when he was younger, and how his mom would tend to him with a bowl of cheap canned soup and a sleeve of crackers. It was an unexpected oasis of peace in a sea of chaos. His sanctuary was shattered, however, as the Selkie and Necromancer continued their arguing over their own meals.
I'm just saying, I want some assurances that you two won't do something that will have us running for the train at midnight again.
Indiga took a small bowl of boiled eggs as the old man set it down on the table. He dumped one into his own bowl and passed it to the others. He tucked into his meal, slurping the noodles off his chopsticks, suspicion written in his narrowed gaze. Artemis stared down at his bland and boring bowl of what was basically just boiled pasta. He sighed and took the last egg on offer and tried his best to ignore the criticism from the Selkie. He shouldn't be mad. It wasn't Indiga's fault. He was too simple to understand what he and Eric were doing. It wasn't his fault. Obus had interfered, and had he not, the two of them would have crossed the threshold into manipulating time, fixing not only Eric's past, but his own. He was so close to getting back his friend. He could almost taste it, which was a far more tantalizing prospect than the plain buckwheat noodles in the bowl before him. Indiga pointed a chopstick in the necromancer's direction.
What we need is better communication.
Right now, we need less, not more. Artemis spoke at last, glaring over at the Selkie. Perhaps it's possible for you to keep your thoughts to yourself.
Oh, and perhaps you can stop trying to tempt my friend down the wrong path.
The wrong? Artemis set his bowl back down, his food hardly touched. Do you think that this is some kind of storybook quest? That I'm the villain? He slid off the stool, his tone hardening. The world is rarely so cut and dry. Right and wrong are just poorly assigned words used to reduce unimaginably complex matters in a way that makes it easy to justify your own moral grandstanding. He shoved himself away from the counter and stood. You try losing what I have, and then see if your sense of right and wrong still apply. Until then, I will keep trying to revive my friend, and I don't care how I get there, but I will. So do us all a favor and shut up. Indiga opened his mouth, noodles hanging out past his lips, when the necromancer swiveled on his heel and threw back the canvas flap, disappearing into the rain. They sat in silence for several moments, the shock of the moment settling over them. Indiga narrowed his gaze as it shifted to the half-elf beside him.
You're awfully quiet.
Eric set down his food, exhaustion creeping back in. Why do you care so much? He couldn't quite put his finger on why, but Indiga understood there was something off with the elf. You look terrible. Was it the frazzled ends of his hair sticking out in all directions, the dark bags of purple that lined beneath his eyes, the several new strands of gray in his beard? He shook his head when he realized the man's bright blue irises had dulled, the light in them having faded. No, I mean it. Eric glanced over at the sulky. In all honesty, why are you my friend? We barely know each other. Indiga set his chopsticks down, shifting in his seat to face the elf directly. Can I be real with you for a moment? He nodded, but Eric was staring down at the untouched contents of Artemis's bowl. His gaze flickered between the noodles, the stool, and the doorway a full 5 times before he shrugged and began transferring the plain noodles into what remained of his own broth. We're friends because you need one. I don't know if you realize, but you don't have the best judgment. You're a good guy. I can see that you want to do the right thing, but I don't think you know what that is. Indiga put a hand on the elf's forearm, grabbing his attention. You're supposed to be showing these gods that you can be trusted. This isn't about you, but whether the timeline would be safe around you. If you're not careful, well... Using a chopstick, Eric slowly spun the remaining soup, thinking. You put a lot of faith in these gods, don't you? With a laugh, Indiga shrugged. Well, yeah, I mean, gods, right? They know more than we do. Eric sighed. He wasn't so sure of that. And even if they did, the stakes had been raised again. His father was now another casualty of his miscalculation. One more, admittedly important, variable in this equation that teetered on the edge. He opened his mouth to respond, still unsure of what he was going to say, when the canvas flap that separated the little shop from the rainy outside flipped open and Artemis stomped back in. You need to come out and see this. He didn't need to turn to recognize that wintry voice, but Lucas did all the same. He wasn't sure how he had missed her arrival. She was wearing a bright red suit, after all, and as everyone knows, red is a horrible camouflage color. Her veil was black this time, emblazoned with a closed eye embroidered in gold. He opened his mouth several times, unsure where the air had taken off to. He wrapped his fingers around the ring beneath his uniform, attempting to absorb any courage it had left in it, but hesitation rose in his gut like a creeping thorn vine. Lucas was afraid of her and what he had found out, afraid that if he spoke the truth, he'd meet a quick end, and above all else, he was afraid that, even after discovering Vel was still alive, he'd never break free of this hotel or his contract to find out for himself. Atlas's eye shot between his boss and his friend, back and forth, before he let out a dramatic sigh. He could recognize a drowning victim. He threw on his brightest, widest smile and stepped forward. He dragged out the word, searching for a lie among those around him. He glanced from Lucas to the nearest group of family members, to Captain Bram, now in a heated argument with Aunt Flora, and then back. Found out that your birthday is coming up. His voice ticked up in surprise with each word that fell from his mouth as he smiled at his own cunning. You didn't tell me you were a Virgo. She gave the Arcanist a flat look, seeing through the obvious fib. I am here to monitor your performance, and I must say, it's not going so well. Miranda put on a fake grimace. The two of you
Gossiping when you should be working.
No, you have a secret.
Courage found at last, Lucas was surprised by how calm his voice was, despite the growing dread in his gut. Miranda paused in the middle of pulling a notebook from her suit pocket and slowly turned her head to face the dryad. A secret, you say? And what kind of secret do you think I'm keeping?
I know about the garden.
Her pulse skipped a beat, the air around her stuttering as her snakes began to stir. She forced her lips into a curious smile. What garden? It was not a question, but a warning, one that Lucas chose to ignore. He was tired of being scared, being broken since he had lost so much, and a glimmer of who he was at his core was finally starting to break back to the surface.
We both know which one I'm talking about.
The snakes in her hair began to uncoil. The sound of their scales scraping against one another sent a shiver down his spine, a reaction he was sure she noticed, but he continued anyway.
In case you need a refresher.
He closed his eyes, recalling what he had seen. The closet in the back of her office, hidden behind a bookcase. It had the same magic as this room, changing its size to fit the demand.
Marble columns draped in ivy, rolling hills of unkempt bluegrass, and,
he returned his attention to the Gorgon,
thousands of statues, all of them very lifelike. Too lifelike.
Now, the Mint Ranch was unique, to say the least. Not only could it make tiny changes, like growing stools out of the ground or adding an extra barbecue pit when a client needed it, but the entire design of the room could be altered. For something on that scale, however, it would take a member of management to visualize the change, compelling the magic to override the current setting to whatever was required. And at that moment, despite her best efforts, Miranda couldn't keep her mind off the description that Lucas had spoken aloud. And the room acquiesced. Deep rumbles shook the ground, and screams burst out over the mundane chatter when everything began to shift. Horseshoes were sent flying into the air as the sandpits were replaced by blades of grass. The volleyball nets were sucked back into non-existence, and the sunny sky flickered several times before it faded to a dull, cloudy gray. The benches, lounge chairs, barbecue pits, and umbrellas were then replaced by statues. Miranda's calculated facade broke as she struggled to retain her balance, her gaze snapping to each figure of stone she recognized. She thrust a finger at the dryad, snarling, "This proves nothing!" Lucas was just as shocked as she was, and even though he tried to hide it, he knew it was written plainly on his face. Atlas was ready to grab his friend and bolt. Bram and Undine would only slow them down, but he was interrupted when a statue burst out of the ground directly beneath his feet. He danced back, narrowly avoiding being speared by the stone hand of a figure frozen in her last moments, terror twisting her features into grotesque proportions. He frowned at the familiar hotel uniform as he walked around the statue. His gaze moved across her lapel to read the name Stephanie on her badge, spelt with an F for some inane reason. Atlas looked over at the dryad, and then to his boss. "What is all this?" Miranda's lips were pursed tight, corners pulled down in disgust, as she tried and failed to reset the room, her mind too scattered. "What do you want?" Her voice was low, barely a whisper, but Lucas caught every word.
Our contract's concluded. All a year's worth. You'll sign off on them, releasing the four of us from this building and our community service.
She didn't attempt to hide her hysterical laughter. Her hand moved across her stomach as she threw her head back and cackled. She remained that way for several moments, guffawing until her sides hurt. "Oh, I didn't think so, dear." Miranda brought her smile back down with a shake of her head. I've only ever concluded one contract, and that's because the man chose to stay here anyway. Her lips parted around her white teeth. One of you may go, the rest must stay. Atlas had almost immediately thrust his hand in Miranda's face, but he was shoved back by the Dryad. No! Lucas leaned in, holding down a squirming Arcanist. All of us, or lower management, hears all about your little scam. He glanced to his friend, his own smile curling his lips. She's a prisoner here, just like us, but she's been fast-tracking her own sentence by cooking the books. He moved his hand to gesture at one of the statues. She gets credit for every employee she manages, so all those about to be discharged, she freezes and then alters their records to extend their sentence and shorten hers. Her smile faltered, lips twitching into a snarl. It had been a long time since Miranda felt backed into a corner, and her own attention wavered between the unveiled skeletons in her literal closet, out on display for thousands to see, to the Dryad before her. Her nails dug divots into her palm until she felt the trickle of blood between her fingers. I'm not about to release the four of you from your binding contracts after only a couple of months over what amounts to a few misplaced time-off requests. Oh, and I suppose all these are just decorations, darling. Lucas mocked her voice with a roll of his eyes. Well, I have proof and a witness, one that's very unhappy with you. So what's it gonna be? Our freedom? Or do I have to have a conversation with a very short-tempered eldritch being downstairs? Anger coursed through her like venom, and it took everything Miranda had not to turn this little pipsqueak to stone right then and there. The room full of witnesses be damned. But that would require a lot more paperwork than she wanted, and she relaxed her fingers. Fine. Let's make a deal. You tell... Her words became a scream as the statue nearest her exploded into rubble as two figures crashed through it and right into her. The three of them spilled onto the grass, tangled and struggling. Miranda wrestled her way out from beneath the other two, scrabbling away before punches began landing. The warrior Dryad, Undine, was straddled across the waist of a woman in a hotel uniform with blonde ringlets. Ruby kicked and punched at her assailant, but without her battle armor, her attacks landed unnoticed. She was helpless beneath the warrior when a hand clamped tight around her neck and she was bodily lifted from the ground and thrown through the air. She barely had a moment to catch her breath, her ribs bruised and her lungs tight, when her back slammed into a stone statue, and then another, and then another. She hit the ground painfully, coughing around the cloud of dust that clogged her vision. Ruby turned back toward the warrior Dryad, her body screaming with every little motion, and noticed that the Herculean form of Byron was now standing between them, the pickup truck that had run her over. Hesitating on the spot, Ruby let out a strangled growl and scanned her surroundings for the 100th time that evening. She had painstakingly infiltrated this event under the impression that it was some sort of gala for the gods. This was a divine hotel, after all. The appearance of that thrice-damned Arcanist had been a welcome surprise, but the near-complete lack of godly attendance to this glorified picnic had her scrambling. Undine had prepared for anything, ripping the sleeves from her uniform top so she could move her damn arms. She smiled a little at the almost rabbit-like quiver from the jewel of the Brotherhood. But when Ruby reached into her own uniform pocket and produced a long dagger with a deadly black tip, she froze. Though it didn't remotely resemble any weapon forged from metal, more like it was pried from the jaw of a giant creature, she had no armor to block the attacks from a weapon, especially a possibly poisoned one, and she scoured around for anything. In the end, she picked up a piece of the shattered statue, an arm to be precise, and turned her attention back to the jewel. Her mouth fell open indignantly when she realized the other woman had taken off at a sprint, already disappearing into the panicked members of Atlas's family. There was a scream somewhere ahead of them, and Undine broke into pursuit. She realized this room was full of potential hostages. She scanned through the heads, searching for that damned black bow. "Oh my God! She's killed Tyrants!" Atlas, following the warrior dryad best he could, paused, scanning the faces around him. He wasn't sure which family member had said it, but then Lucas pointed out a gap in the crowd, and, sure enough, Uncle Terrence was dead in Ruby's arm. Well, not really. Gods couldn't die unless they lost all their believers. They just regenerated a little worse for wear, and realization washed over him as he froze. The only reason to kill one was to... Oh, bollocks! Lucas turned his worried eyes on the Arcanist. Why's she glowing like that? Eric, supporting Indiga, stepped out of the noodle shop, holding open the flap with one arm above his head. His eyes had hardly adjusted when a trumpeting fanfare startled him, quite literally, off his feet. He stumbled, his lack of toes causing him to trip and drop the selkie as he fell onto his rump with a painful yelp. Duck did a few laps around them, whining and yowling, until Indiga climbed to his one leg with the dog's support. He turned his attention to the source of the sound, and was utterly slack-jawed to find no less than 20 short and stocky people taking up the whole of the alleyway. Some held out banners displaying a mechanical turtle, while others were tossing small cut gemstones into the air, causing the braver members of the onlooking crowd to dash in and pocket the glittering jewels. Rubbing at his backside, Eric sat up with a wince and a groan. What the hell? His words fell short as he caught sight of the man standing before him, adorned in gleaming brass armor and a crown atop the elaborate braids of his hair. Well, not a man, a dwarf. He had met dwarves before, and even though this one was considerably shorter, it was the others that surrounded their leader that gave him pause. They all wore fancy armor in shades of copper and gold, but some appeared to be molded to their bodies rather than for their bodies. Their joints gave a little hiss of steam every time one of them moved, and a gentle whirring sound could be heard, like the inner workings of a machine. Even their faces were masks with glowing gems for eyes. Clockwork soldiers, maybe?
Chronomancer!
The crowned leader stepped forward, shooting a glance between the human, the half-elf, and the selkie, before offering them a short and curt bow.
We have been searching the city for you, and now that we have found you, the Great One wishes to have a word.
The Great One? With Artemis's help, Eric was hoisted to his feet. He could hardly wipe the frown of confusion from his face, especially as he stared at the fully mechanical members of his escort party.
Yes, our benevolent and all-seeing ruler, Arkesh, has requested an audience. My name is Dromir.
The dwarf took a step back, gesturing to the end of the alley.
If you and your companions would please, we must return to the bellows before my associates cool any further.
Eric exchanged a look with the other two. Indigo was already astride Duck, eagerness plain on his face, but Artemis was staring at the mechanical dwarves. That look, he had seen it on his own face plenty of times. It was hunger for knowledge. He turned back to the party of dwarves and waved aimlessly. Lead on, then. In the following hours, Eric would come to regret that decision. If he had known the trip to these so-called bellows would involve delving into the depths of the very active volcano, he might have argued to have this meeting above ground, where it was cooler, and there was air. They had been escorted into a nondescript building, a disused textile shop by the looks of it, and into the basement where a pair of heavy metal doors awaited them. Two of Dromir's entourage flung them open as if they were nothing more than fabric panels, and they, Duck included, were encouraged into the depths of hell itself. It was hot, hotter than any forge in the height of summer, and by far hotter than anything Eric had ever experienced. The path was made of copper-plated stone stairs that were constructed out of the walls of the volcano itself, with landings and corridors leading off every dozen or so steps as they descended. He ran his fingers along the walls, feeling tool marks. This place had definitely been carved by hand, unlike the city above. He paused, tentatively leaning over the railing to peer below. The entire core of the volcano had been illuminated by the gently glowing walls and tunnels, but even that far down, it was only red-tinged darkness.
Dromir? Where does this lead?
Eric scooched back over to the safe side of the steps, swallowing as he looked up at their progress with a slight sway in his body. At the sudden break to the silence, Dromir pulled to a stop with a haughty sniff.
This path will take us all the way down to the very heart of the volcano.
He turned, his armor echoing noisily off the walls.
Why?
Well, where I'm from, there's this story about some dwarves that dug too far down.
Eric pulled a face.
And found a great monster in their mountain. Dromir released a thunderous boom of laughter, clapping his own thigh in delight as he shook his head.
You're funny. Arkesh did not tell me you had a sense of humor.
He spun back around, returning his steady gait into descending the steps.
No, little elf. There is no monster at the end of this path. There is only our people, a chosen few outsiders who wish to learn our craft, and the Great One.
With every step, Duck whined and howled, prancing on the spot before being tugged down to the next level. Indiga did his best to soothe his buddy, but given the amount of sweat currently soaking his own clothes, he understood how miserable his furry friend was a little too well.
What craft is it that you teach down here?
Artemis had shuffled a few paces ahead of the others, shucking his coat to throw it over his shoulder. Dromir stopped, craning his neck to stare up at the human with narrowed eyes.
Why do you ask?
Undoing the top few buttons of his shirt, Artemis looked around. There were great glowing veins of precious metals flowing through the crags in the volcanic walls. Crystals the size of horses glittered in the flickering ember lights, and gemstones lined the edge of their path. But none of that interested him.
There is something akin to magic here. I can feel it, but it's not sorcery. It's...
He struggled to find his words.
It's...
Eric could tell what the necromancer was struggling with because he felt it too. And with a jolt, he realized what it was.
Science. There's the smell of creation in the air.
Bizarre as it was, and despite the heat and sulfur, something about this place reminded him of a laboratory, or even the halls of his old university. It made no sense, but it was there. Innovation. Dromir regarded the two with a half-cocked smile hidden behind his bushy mustache before he belted out another hearty laugh.
Oh, very clever. Very clever.
He looked from the elf to the human.
Yes, we create down here.
He began moving again, trailing his thick fingers down the volcanic walls.
Like our beloved mountain, our people are put under immense pressure, and we too are reforged again and again.
Eric glanced at the closest robotic dwarf, wondering what exactly he meant by that. When they came to the final landing, Dromir turned and led their party into a room guarded by a white stone door. He pushed against several runes near the handles before they glowed with the fires of magma. When the lines met at the seam of the door, it split in two and opened. Eric, lost in the horrified wonder that he was standing inside a volcano, stared up at the massive room beyond that was filled with copper tubes and brass pipes that all fed into steel tubs. He followed their winding paths to see hoses connected to some sort of mold press.
When the people of the mountain are born, they are literally born from the volcano itself, from Mugran.
Dromir flourished a hand to the ceiling of the room, inviting the visitors to look up. Following the gesture, Eric could see where the pipes and tubes all fed out of, a great swirling vat of magma. It burned hot, bright enough to illuminate this room and the next, and it was thick. The viscous liquid inside showed its movements like the lines in a flowing river.
But
Dromir dropped his hand with a heavy sigh.
Mugranins are short-lived. Like the lava they are created from, they will begin to cool with every passing day. Most of them don't live past 10 years before they are hardened into statues, unmoving stone. So, when one is born, they are immediately tasked with forging their next bodies.
He nodded at several mechanical figures that lined the walls in rows. Forge their next bodies? Artemis loosened the cravat around his neck as he stared at the machines. He approached one, tracing the dwarvish features carved from metal. His fingers sizzled against the heat, and he recoiled. Dromir laughed.
Fleshlings like us need to be careful down here.
He turned and snapped his fingers at the nearest Mugrarnin.
Fetch us some brass so that we may craft these humans some protective wear.
As the others parted, fulfilling the request with haste, he returned his attention to the half-elf.
But you, Chronomancer, must follow me.
He pointed as the other two shifted to join.
Just the Chronomancer. Your companions may stay here until you return.
My name is Eric, he corrected, not liking such a title attached to his shoulders.
Good to know, Chronomancer.
Dromir smiled.
Come, Arkesh would like a word with you.
Through several more magical doors, the armored dwarf led him down to a corridor that was lined with aquarium-style windows that allowed Eric to peer into the churning magma. He stopped when a flash of movement caught his attention. A black, craggy fin. Is something swimming in there? Dromir waved him off.
Don't mind the sharks.
What? No, I do mind the sharks. Thank you very much. Eric's voice had reached a new level of high-pitched, one that amused his guide, judging by the furious laughter that followed.
I say don't mind them because they cannot get in here. And if they ever do, you have much bigger concerns than lava sharks to worry about.
Dromir took a left at the end of the aquarium bridge and held open a rather unremarkable door. Eric stepped inside, relatively positive that whatever they had on display in here would ratchet his fear response to even newer, untold heights. Maybe magma spiders. Ugh. He gave an involuntary shudder at the thought. He was, however, pleasantly surprised to see something, well, familiar. Cables and wires crisscrossed the ground and the ceiling, and they all led to a large, button-laden table. A glowing screen hovered over it, and, just beyond that, barely obscured by the floating numbers and cryptic text, was the largest tortoise he had ever seen. Carved from roughly hewn iron, each point on its massive shell was a small smokestack that burned bright and puffed out thin plumes of soot. The eyes of the creature were dark, but its mouth was open, revealing a bright orange center inside. The veins of red that snaked across its body told Eric this thing was fueled by liquid fire.
Oh, great Arkesh, I have brought the Chronomancer, as requested.
Dromir made a grandiose bow before the Great One. He remained that way for several moments, waiting. and waiting. He pulled a face as he straightened up and blinked. He scrutinized the beast for a moment before he moved to the podium that held the glowing screen.
Ah, damn. That explains it.
Clearly, the dwarf had read something in that floating text that Eric could not decipher, and he held out his hands in question. Explains what? Anxious for something extraordinary to happen? He was disappointed when nothing did. Dromir pointed at the screen with a shrug.
His operating system crashed again. You'll have to wait for him to reboot before you can complete whatever it was you were brought here to do.
Eric's eyes went wide. Your god is a computer? He blinked rapidly, trying to grasp the implications of that. Then a sinking feeling hit him. Dromir, how long does it take him to reboot?
Not long.
Dromir began tapping at the massive keypad again.
Perhaps a week or so.
Eric slumped back into the only empty seat in the room. Of course. You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description. Oh, I'm sorry, buddy. I know it's hot, but Eric should be back soon. Okay, I'll ask. Hey, Mr. Metal Dwarf guy?
Yes?
Oh, hey, you do talk.
Yes.
So, my furry friend here isn't doing so good in this heat, see? Any chance we could go somewhere cooler while we wait for my friend?
I could escort you back up the stairs.
Yeah, I don't think he's really up for climbing half a mile of stairs right now.
Well, there is always the elevator, but I don't think you would want to use that.
Why not? That sounds perfect.
Because it's currently infested with magma spiders.
Magma? Spiders? Oh, I know. How about some fur clippers instead?